And now, please join us in welcoming Daniel Forrester to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back at BoardSource. I got to meet many of you in 2012, and I'm here this morning to actually build off the ideas that my dear friend just introduced to the world, this word of intention. She and I did not coordinate our speeches, by the way. She didn't see what I'm about to talk to you about, and I think there's a moment of synchronicity going on there. So I want to talk about the state of being inside boards today. I want to talk about what I'm seeing in the world of leadership. And I want to offer you all some thoughts about the state of intention. I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of non-for-profits and purpose-driven organizations. And I think that boards, most often in my experience, are not greater than the sum of their parts. And that's the reason you have a board. You want that group to come together in a more cohesive way. But before we can become greater than the sum of our parts, I think as individuals, we have to come to grips with a bunch of things that are happening inside the world today. This should sound familiar to you. We are living in an age of being bombarded with information, and I think we're actually allowing it to come into our consciousness by choice. There's nothing we can quite do about it, but I think we can be more intentional about how we address the content coming at us. It's almost a constant. I see a sort of what I call an action bias in almost all of my interactions with groups and leaders and organizations. This idea that if you're doing something, if you're in motion, surely we're going to be having an impact. Sometimes your best move may not be to take any action at all, and it may be to think. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of thinking here in a moment. There's a big pressure on all of us to multitask. How many of us are having that Pavlovian urge right now to reach down to that cell phone? I'm shortly going to share a statistic with you. My team, we actually calculated in a moment, if I was a really boring speaker, how often you all as a group would have checked your cell phones. Wait till you hear the number, ladies and gentlemen. It's stunning. You can't multitask. When you multitask, it makes you less of a leader. It makes you less intentional. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. We are tethered to our offices. What does that mean? There's a digital cord that connects us 24/7 these days. I didn't want it to happen that way, it just did. Tethering has consequences. This idea of home and work and I'm going to get a balanced life, I think you have to make incredible choices to cut away from work because work is not everything we need to do. Tethering is a reality that most organizations aren't coming to grips with. I think there's a culture, and I used this word many years ago, and I don't use it anymore. When someone says, "How you doing?" I am so busy. How many people have said that to you this week? I'm just so busy. Think about what a turnoff that is to the people in your organization. It's actually telling the world that you're out of control. Busyness and activity and being in motion aren't what the tenets are of great leadership. I no longer tell people I'm busy. I tell them I'm working and I'm in the moment and I'm doing everything I can to be present for what's happening. Because all I have and all we have is this moment right now. So that's the world that we're living in. Here's some statistics. Again, if I was a really boring speaker and you guys just wanted to pick up your cell phones for the first time, let's tell you what's happening in this room. We actually did some calculations based on how much data would be coming into this room based on about 900 different people. That's what we said. You all, right now, and in the next 40 minutes, will receive somewhere around 6,300 emails just as a group here. As a collective group, we will spend about 164 minutes of our lives, if I was a boring speaker, deleting and curating and keeping up with what's going on. But wait, there's more. You all would have written about 1,700 emails. You're not until the end of this presentation, and you're going to say that guy was pretty good. God invented text messages. I'm sure we've all got them. There's 1,000 would have come in. This was the big one. You ready for this statistic? As a group, we would have checked our cell phones, again, if I was a really boring speaker, 10,400 times. Marissa Mayer was recently in Davos, Switzerland, and on a panel discussion, I love this lady. I think she's doing great work. It's tough to be the CEO of Yahoo. She proudly admitted that she checks her cell phone on average over 200 times a day. And I thought to myself, I like her, I respect her. But do I want to work for a leader who says that I'm going to fragment my attention on my own accord 200 plus times a day? Make no mistake, I love my iPhone. I will get the iPhone 6. I love it. I love everything Apple does. I can't wait to get that iWatch. And I told my wife we're going to use that heart thing, and she said, that's weird. We're not doing that. I'm going to get it for her anyway. You can't fracture your attention. Calls would have come in. Here's the last one. One day God invented Facebook. You all would have spent collectively 21 hours on Facebook as a group in the last hour. You also would have given out 271 likes. And I'll tell you, I'll take those likes. But let's do it at the end of this presentation. I love validation. I absolutely love validation. How do leaders and boards create the space for decisive thought? What is decisive thought? I thought about the origin of that term. I studied Latin. My dad talked me into studying Latin for 4 years in high school. I had a quiz in Latin every day for 4 years in high school. And it was a tough language. That's a very dead language. It's an incredibly dead language. But it taught me how to think about the origin of words. And when I thought about decisions and decisive thought, which is what boards are called to do, I thought about the origin of that term. And there it is. It comes from the Latin term decidere. And that's my little Italian. That's the best I'm going to do there. Decidere. The literal interpretation of when we make a decision is that we cut away from all of the possibilities. That's what the origin of the term is. How can you cut away from all other possibilities when you're fragmenting your time? We're not doing the prep work to get in the room and be prepared. The decisive thought can't just happen in the boardroom. It has to happen beforehand. Think about that term, to cut away from. I got to talk a little bit about multitasking because I had to come to grips with multitasking as a leader. How many of you consider yourself multitaskers? Okay. I did too until I started to read the literature and understand the science behind it. Multitasking is a human impossibility. And I'm not talking about, and I said this in front of an audience one time, and a mom came up to me. She said, I put the food in the oven and I'm down doing laundry. You telling me I can't multitask? I said, no, ma'am, I'm not saying that at all. I said, I'm telling you that when you try to do two technology-driven media tasks at the same time and actually get to a coherent thought, you are decaying your ability to be effective. Dr. Nass, who died sadly last year in a car accident from Stanford, he did an amazing job putting a vocabulary around this. His studies are worthy of looking at. Here's some of his pieces. He said multitasking actually erodes our productivity because we don't calculate what happens to when that thing was that we had a big idea. We want to come back to it. There is no evidence that multitasking makes us more effective. I will share with you, I found one study from the University of Utah that there are some of us who can do multitasking. They couldn't figure it out, but it's about 2.5% of the population actually are able to look at the two screens, two devices, and be in the moment. Let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, you are in the 97%. And the 2% of folks, here's what happens with multitaskers, by the way, and Dr. Nass proved it. The better you think you are at multitasking, the worse you perform. And Dr. Nass put people inside functional MRIs and watched the parts of our brain that lit up. What's my so what here? This beautiful thing that we were given is a single tasking tool. And I'm not saying that you can't try to shift between tasks in a day, but when we fracture our attention, I think we become slightly less than we're capable of. And when you bring that fractured attention into the boardroom, I think the conversation is degraded. This is a study that I reference a lot from my dear colleagues at Basics that sadly no longer are around, and it's kind of stood the test of time. See if this sort of resembles your day. 30% of your day, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be spent getting interrupted by things that are not important and recovering from those things. I'm seeing a lot of head nodding. I'm getting a lot of affirmation in the second row here. Think about that. You're giving up a third of your day to being interrupted. With the device and the screen on and the multitasking narrative in front of you, I would argue that's where most of that's coming from. 25% of your day is going to be spent creating content, okay? So we have to write those emails, we have to respond. 20% in meetings. How many of you in this last week have been in a really good meeting? I want to work at that. I want to work. What is your organization? Because I want to work there. Most meetings that I experience are less than the sum of their parts. Most of them, and I share with my colleagues here in the front row, some dear friends I have, they don't have a purpose, they don't have an approach, they don't have a facilitator, and they don't have a deliverable. That's intentionality. Board meetings that don't have that level of preparation, it's not going to happen. But we have to spend a lot of time in meetings. We spend 15% of our day just absorbing content that's coming at it. I would argue I'm part of your 15% right now. But here was the kicker for me. Five percent of your day is thinking and reflecting. I spent my life filling this thing up. I spent my life, and then I went to Catholic University down here in Washington, D.C. Then I spent 2 more years at graduate school. And then I showed up at the firm. And this is what my days become. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a big problem in this country. If we are going to rise and design a new intentionality into the way we design our organizations, something's got to give here. My friends at McKinsey did a fabulous job, and they put a great study out there last year that I wanted to share with you. They looked at satisfied executives. Most executives, by the way, are deeply dissatisfied people. We're talking about the Globetrotters, the folks that run around, they run big things, big statistically significant, but there was 9% of the McKinsey study that said, I'm satisfied with how the world's working. So McKinsey drilled down and said, what's going on? What's happening in their habits? 7% of the happy guys' days are spent with boards. You could see how much time they spend with external stakeholders, with other employees. The happy guys spent about 15% of their days one-on-one. I thought that was pretty interesting, but it gets better. 17% of their days were spent with customers. I don't know about you, I'm a consultant, so my favorite parts of every day are when I'm with clients, handling wickedly hard problems and thinking those through. I'm not dissatisfied when I'm with my colleagues, but my happiest moment is when I'm with clients. Here's the kicker. The happiest ones spent 24% of their time alone. Anyone in this room resemble this? Anyone clamoring for this? In other words, they controlled the chaos. They wanted to be by themselves. They wanted to be reading, I would argue, rereading. I'm now started the practice. There's so much coming at me. I reread things from years ago that I thought I believed in to see if I actually digested it the first time. That's intention. There's something going on here with the alone. Then they broke it down and they said, well, what are the technologies and the things that the happy guys are using? 21% of their time on the phone. By the way, they push down on the immediate technologies. They use it. These aren't technology laggards. 8% in real-time messages. 28% of their time is in asynchronous conversation. Email happens. The happy guys spend 38% of their days in face-to-face situations. This, to me, was sort of telling, and especially on the alone side, because many of us are not doing that. I use Colin Powell as a great example. Colin Powell had hours within his schedule when he was Secretary of State in which the door was closed and he was alone, reading and thinking. And this is a man whose sort of dossier was the world. Mitchell Reese, my dear friend who just took over at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, was one of his strategists. And he said he was astounded to discover that behavior. Guess what? I think Powell fits into that mode because in order to frame decisive thought, to bring intention into his work, and to brief a president of the United States, when you don't give the president one option, you're there to present the whole gambit of options. I love Powell as an example. I think many leaders should try to get it. I couldn't make this up. My team found this the other day. There's the study. They gave people a choice to say, first of all, the assignment was, go in a room alone and think and see if you can hold your own attention for 5 minutes. Then they put a ton of incentives in the room and distractions. They even had a distraction where you could self-administer, I'm not making this up, an electronic shock. the majority of people, when it came time for them to come to the moment of reflection, self-administered an electronic shock. This wasn't just the millennials. We blame the millennials for everything. This was all of us. It was a normal distribution. What's my so what? My so what is that the state of thinking is under attack, that thinking and getting to decisive thought is what we're called to do, that boards and individuals can't become greater than the sum of their parts unless we sort of reset the contract with ourselves. Let's not be in that space. So I thought I'd take you into a couple of journeys, some things that I'm pretty passionate about because I always like to give practical thoughts. I'm going to share with you that when you're in the state of reflection, which is what I'm trying to get you into, that's the moment when the real juice starts. And I have three sort of modules I want to walk you through quickly. First is this idea that the first job of leaders is to get the big ideas right. The second is that the culture in your organizations matter, and they are a boardroom imperative in my mind. You cannot decouple yourself from saying, I think the culture seems to be healthy. I'm going to argue the difference, and I have some data to back it up. Finally, what is the currency of a board? What does a board do? What do they give out? What's exchanged? They exchange dialogue. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think is happening inside dialogue, because dialogue is a lost art in my estimation. This framework of getting the big ideas right, I cannot take any credit for it. I can't, and I'm going to give them full props. I had the great fortune to get to know, to study, and to learn from General David Petraeus. And this is his framework that I'm actually going to apply real time in this room to an organization, and it's my friends from the ALS Association, which ironically I met them last night at the bar, so we'll see how this goes. But Petraeus said to me something that really made me think. He said, Daniel, the first job of a leader, and I would argue that the first job of a board, is to get the big ideas right. They do not fall from the tree like the apple did on Newton's head. They take time, they take deep reflection. I think all the time as I run my company, what are the big ideas in my firm? What do we stand for? And do all the people in my organization know it? Is my leadership team aligned around the big ideas? Our purpose, our vision, what we will focus on, what makes us special? And that list can't be 100 things long. In your board that you are a part of, what are the big ideas? If I interviewed each one of the board members individually, would you be able to tell me with fidelity and language what those big ideas are? And is there a translation moment to the leadership that execute it? The first job of a leader is to get the big ideas right, and they don't fall from the tree like the apple did on Newton's head. Great point, General. Thank you. Tell me more. He said, well, the next thing we have to do is communicate those ideas. And I don't know about you, but I see leaders under-communicating mission, vision, values, and strategy, in my experience, by an order of magnitude of 10. And I don't have the answers for that. And there's many talented communications experts in this room. It breaks down when the big ideas aren't communicated well and right. Wait a minute. We actually have to be accountable and oversee and implement these big ideas. We have to find the feedback loops to see what's going on. That makes sense. But the last part was the one that I loved the most. He said the final part of this framework is that we have to refine the big ideas and become a learning organization. How many of you in this room would say that my organization is and will remain a learning organization? I'm telling you, I love a couple of hands going up. This is the calling of our time. How do we live through a cycle like this? And you can disagree with Petraeus. But if you don't have a framework like this that your board sort of thinks through, I think you're going to spin because you'll be action biased and distracted. And I think there's something going on there. So I wondered what would happen if I took Petraeus' framework and applied it. But before I do that, I thought it would be great to sort of brag about my two beautiful children, because they're gorgeous. And how many of you in this room took the Ice Bucket Challenge? Unbelievable. I watched that with awe this summer. I still don't think we understand as a country quite what happened there. It's amazing. And since my kids are just the cutest darn thing in the world, I thought it'd be fun to show you what happened when Charlotte Jane took the Ice Bucket Challenge this summer. This is 9-year-old William, and Charlotte Jane is 6 years old. She tags 3 people in this who are my sister and my brother-in-law. Their last name is Sadowski. Think about that as my colleagues here just play the clip real quick.
I challenge Charlotte Forrester
to the Ice Bucket Challenge. Here you go, Charlotte. Oh, ice all over. Who you challenge, Momo?
Abby Sagowski, Jacob Sagowski, and Emma Sagowski.
Awesome.
She's that cute. I told my wife I'm just going to give her my wallet now because she writes me little love notes. It's unbelievable, this girl. The answer is yes, Charlotte, absolutely. She's a special kid. She wanted me to tell all of you, because I often try to connect my kids into the rooms that I'm in, and she said, please tell them, Daddy, it was really cold. I said, okay. Fair enough. Thank you, Charlotte. Well, the Ice Bucket Challenge had huge consequences, right? Success has huge consequences. Look at some of these headlines. Maybe you read them. Big question there. I have a friend. I wear this band every day. I have a friend, Nancy, my wife's friend, suffers from ALS, and I've been wearing it. I'll wear it for a long, long time. You know, she's suffering, so she needs direct services right now. But then there's the over-the-horizon stuff. So I thought to myself, could you imagine if you're on the board of the ALS Association? Things were moving along at a nice, steady clip, and then boom, something changed. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the last several months as they dissected this. So go back to Petraeus' framework here. What are the big ideas? How much do we give out in direct funding? What are the bets we make? Who will we bet on? What do we do for direct services right now? If you have ALS, the cure is likely not going to come quick enough. In the world that my wife is working on right now, they're trying to get a van for Debbie because she just simply can't get out in the wintertime. Do we spend money on that? I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall as that was debated. And then how do you coalesce around what, 20 big ideas? 3, 4, and then we're done. No, you're not done. Absolutely not. I think the stakes just raised higher for the ALS Association because their communications posture now features many in this room who didn't even have, they had no connection to before. Their communication up and down and sideways. Another huge challenge. And how do you get back and tell all the donors what you did with the money if you get the big ideas right? Some of these interventions are going to take time. How will we message that? Amazing idea there. ALS has been around for a long, long time, sadly. I don't think it's going to be eradicated quickly enough. How will they oversee that? What will they measure? Here's my wish for the ALS Association. First of all, I wish they get rid of this terrible disease, and they have a huge role in that. My greater wish is that they become a beacon of a learning organization that every one of us sees as the great case study of our time. For if they go, and they're going to go through this is already happening. The question is, can they learn faster than anyone else as an organization and turn that into the refinement of the next set of big ideas? I wish them so much luck in that journey. And I can't wait because I think it could be one of the great case studies of our time. And in the dawn of social impact investing, when we have the prospect of $1 trillion over the next decade, possibly moving into the social causes you work on, your Ice Bucket Challenge may not be someone pouring it over their head, but you may actually have the resources to do things that you never imagined before. This cycle is coming to a theater near you, and boards have to step up their games. Second thing I want to talk about is that culture. If the strategy is right, which is really what I was just talking about, if you get the strategy right, leaders and boards can't dissolve themselves from saying what's happening inside the culture of my organization. I believe what Peter Drucker taught the world, that culture will eat strategy alive for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you do not have a high-performing team ready to receive all of the intention that comes from our board, I assure you, you will give the world a lot of great PowerPoint presentations. You will not change the world. I work a lot with organizations not only to do strategy, but increasingly we're mixing that with culture because we did not want to divorce ourselves and the CEOs and boards I work from understanding the nexus between the two of them. Many organizations, how many of your organizations have a set of core values? I do. How many of you if I interviewed you, could actually repeat them out loud and tell me the behaviors. That's a separate issue. I want to share with you an interesting, very well-known American company, and I'm going to reveal for you their core values. And I'd love in a moment for you to tell me and take some guesses at who they are. Their first core value, respect. We will not tolerate abusive or disrespectful treatment. This sentence, talk about a behavior. Ruthlessness, callousness, and arrogance don't belong here. Whew. That's a very specific statement. It's what I call a behavioral statement. The value is sort of the headline. Culture comes down to the way things are done around here. So they're saying the way things are done around here is that if you're a ruthless person, do not apply. I like that. I don't like working with ruthless people. Integrity, the most chosen core value of every organization. I tell my clients now, don't choose it as a core value. And they say, why? I said, because I think integrity is the oxygen of American organizational tempos today. It is just assumed. Nonetheless, this organization asserted integrity, and then they said, when we say we cannot or will not do something, then we won't do it. I like that as a sub-behavior. Let me build it out. There's communication. We have an obligation to communicate. And then one more. Excellence. Brilliant. Sounds like a cool place. Anybody have a guess of what American company, these were the core values, which were validated, by the way, by their board? Any guesses? Anybody? I can't hear it. Apple? Google? Amazon? This was on the boardroom wall. This was in the hallway as you walked into Enron. This was on screensavers. My dear friend, Colonel David Sutherland, he calls them plaque values. Plaque values. And he was a part of helping the Army to design their core values. I believe it when someone in the military tells me what their values and behaviors are because they die for it, as he reminds, and we see it all the time. And we get to work with organizations because we say to them, is this the culture you're trying to aspire to? This meant nothing in the social contract of Enron. And it's easy to pick on them now. By the way, not everyone that worked on Enron was a bad person, but they were really poorly led because culture comes down to the local leader and to whether or not people walk the walk at the highest level, and that means in the boardroom to start. Ruthlessness, callousness, and arrogance will not be tolerated. It certainly was. My friends at the Barrett Culture Values Center did a survey of 70 .orgs around the world and asked the question, what are the values and behaviors you see in the current culture of your organization? Your organization may have been in this survey, big, giant sample set. And it was all .orgs, so it's folks like us. This is what people chose as some of the current culture. They said, what do you see as the top 10 values and behaviors you're observing in your organization today? Beautiful things, making a difference, community involvement. I'd expect that from the type of people in this room. I think the folks in this room are living at a higher calling. But then there wasn't everything was positive. They had cost reduction, bureaucracy, my favorite one here, confusion, and hierarchy. 40 different non-for-profits from around the world. This is the data set that came back when you smashed their current cultures together. It was valid in each of their cultures. If you're on a board and there's confusion and hierarchy, do you have a responsibility to ask some hard questions about that inside the culture? I think you do. You can't absolve yourself from culture anymore. The board of Enron absolved itself from culture. I'm suggesting to all of you that if you decouple that, you're not going to lift your organization up to live up to the big ideas. They then asked the question, what would you like to see more of in the desired culture of our organization? It's a great question. By the way, no one ever says, please give me more confusion, right? So that second question, and we do these surveys all the time to our clients, and then we interpret them and we go deep on the data. This is what people wanted to see more of across 40 different organizations. More adaptability, more customer satisfaction, accountability, information sharing. I love that. But then two things jumped out at me as we prepared for this talk today. They wanted to see continuous improvement and people wanted to see continuous learning, which arcs me right back to General Petraeus. The people in your organization are telling you, if you do a kind of survey like this, that this is what they're clamoring for. Grow me, help to grow this organization, help us to learn and remain agile. My big takeaway is that culture matters deeply, and that boards have to not only get immersed in it, but seek to do one thing. You can't change culture, by the way. You can only seek to strengthen it. You go to war with the culture you got. You can seek to strengthen it, and I think it's a boardroom imperative. When was the last time at a board meeting you talked about the culture of your organization? Put it on the agenda next time. Bring some data to the conversation. The last thing I want to talk about, because my time is running low, I see red lights flashing and stuff, is that boards need to engage in a level of dialogue like they've never done before. Dialogue. Bill Isaac said, wonderful book, you read a book called Dialogue? He said it's the art of thinking together. When you're in a boardroom, you're actually trying to get to the state of thinking together. How can you think together with everything I just said at the beginning of this talk? And you're tethered and you're distracted, so we assume that the technology's off. How can you make sure that the dialogue rises to another level? I don't have the final cure for it. I have a couple of ideas. First thing is that great dialogue to me requires moments of pause. And I'll probably get some feedback from my colleagues because we give each other a lot of feedback that I could have paused more even in this talk because I'm throwing a lot of content at you. But when was the last time someone just sort of took a step back in a meeting? And imagine, and by the way, good luck trying to not touch your cell phone as I do this. Let's take 5 seconds just to step back from what we just heard. People need time to think. They need time to process. One of the pause moments that I tell people to do is ask who has the most authority on this topic in the room. Studied from Harvard recently. Who knows the most about this topic? Imagine if you pause and just ask that question. So instead of me pontificating about what I think I know about a topic, because I'm on the board and I'm authorized to speak, I say, who actually knows the most about this? And imagine if the dialogue emanated from the person with the most domain knowledge instead of the person who's most desirable or desires to talk the most. In still moments of pause, I studied the Quaker tradition of how they run organizations in the book that I wrote years ago. When Quaker boards enter into rooms, you know how they enter the room? In complete silence. When they sit, they have a clerk in there. They call it a clerk, not a facilitator. I studied their habits and behaviors because it was so countercultural to how we operate. Be brave. Chairmen of boards in this room, be brave and instill the moments of pause in those time of thinking. It could change the entire trajectory of your organization. Here's something I love to do, and I often tell my clients, take the person who is the most sure about the topic and very passionate and say, hey, Bob, why don't you argue the counter of your position in front of everyone right now? What do you mean? I told you the answer was 6. Well, what if it's 4? Ask people to argue in front of the group the contrary of the opinion that they took, especially if they're digging in. Why? Because you may take them to a side of their brain that they didn't even know existed. Our president, it's a habit actually, and something I picked up from watching him, especially in the first 18 months. I don't know what's happening in every meeting he has, but I often thought to myself, could you imagine if you took a big brain like Hillary Clinton and said, Mrs. Clinton, could you argue the contrary to there? That is one of the most refined brains around. And imagine if she had to debate the contrary. I'd like to see what happens. We're all better off if that moment happens, because we have a lot of confirmation bias when we sit in rooms, and we're all pulling our egos in for about 20 minutes before the meeting even gets going. Try that technique. Think about arguing against yourself. It can't happen all the time, but it can happen. I love Jim Henson. Jim Henson changed my life, and this little, I wanted to say he was green, he's gray right now. We could have figured that out. I think we could have had it. Henson was big on dialogue with his lead collaborator, Jerry Jewell. I studied his life because Henson changed my life. And when he and Jerry Jewell would get into what they called expansive dialogue, that was a very big difference than when they were in the day-to-day running of the business. How often do you make the distinction inside your board of this is an expansive, and we're going to go there conversation, a diverse set of thinking versus a convergent set of thinking. I actually study a lot of the habits of improv comedians, and I apply them inside the workshops we do. One of their techniques, great improv comedians, they use the technique, have you heard of this? Yes and. I see some head nodding. A yes and means I receive everything you said and this. And what it takes us to is absolute absurdity, which is why we love those guys. But I do workshops where one of the ground rules, because we're in expansive dialogue, is to embrace yes and. Because when I go there, I can't shut down what you just said. I have to receive it. I have to process it, add to it, because the and brings me to another place. Most organizations and most boards are not making a distinction between the divergent and the convergent. And I think that that makes a big, big difference. So I ask yourself, is it going to be at the retreat that we'll just have an expansive dialogue? Are the ground rules for the retreats that we all go to the same as the day-to-day when we're doing the how do we get to a decision? Recognize that dialogue is not monolithic. And then call yourselves as a group to say, is this an expansive moment or one where we need to cut down from? The difference is whether you really went there or you just went to where the logic took you. Big difference. Henson taught me a lot about that. I'll close with this picture. This is Thomas Edison's home in Florida. And at the time, before he died, he was arguably one of the most famous people on the planet. And he used to go down that dock and he would fish. And he'd fish a lot. And people would leave him alone when he was fishing. He was the Steve Jobs times 50 of his day. People flew in from around the world to see him in New Jersey, my beloved New Jersey, or down in Florida. And he'd go out on this dock, and there was one rule. When he was fishing, leave Mr. Edison alone. Leave him alone. And then someone noticed about a couple years into this that his bucket would come back and it'd be empty. He never caught a fish. You know why? He never put bait on the end of the line. Not once. He did it to be alone. He did it to think. And I would argue that it made all the difference for everyone in this room. Look at the technology in this room today. He'd be proud. He'd be proud. All roads to me lead to reflection, which is the top of my story. When we push aside reflection, we become less human. When we don't bring reflection into the boardroom, I assure you, your board will be less than the sum of its parts. And I hope with the social challenges we have in this country, that your board becomes so much more than that. The stakes are really high. I am very thankful to be here with you today. I am in awe of the agenda. It is an honor to be back at BoardSource. I wish you an amazing 2 days. Thank you for having me.